Happy New Year. This is our first webinar in the DaSSWeb series of 2025. And to start the year, we are honored to welcome John Baylor from Miami University in Ohio, United States. John perhaps does not need an introduction, but nonetheless, for those who maybe do not know him, John Baylor is now Emeritus Professor and founding chair of Department of Statistics at Miami University in Southwest Ohio, from where he retired 2 years ago. His research interests included quantitative risk estimation, design and analysis of environmental toxicology and occupational health studies, and gerontological data analysis, topics in which he published over 106 peer-reviewed papers, not less than 5 books, 1 audiobook, and several other publications. Also, he has contributed to the ISI Statistics React News blog. He is completely passionate for promoting quantitative literacy and enhancing connections between statistics and journalism. This resulted in a Stats and Stories podcast that he developed for now 12 years with journalism colleagues. In 2020, they received the Joint Program Board in Mathematics Communications Award in recognition for this podcast, for their work for this. Then this later resulted in a book published in 22 and a freely available audio book version, which was released just last year. John Baylor also served as president of the International Statistic Institute, and where he was part of the executive committee the preceding years. He has also been in the American Statistical Association Board of Directors and served in other ASA-related groups, where he currently, in fact, serves as chair of the ASA Excellence in Statistical Reporting Award Committee. John Baylor is fellow of the ASA, AASS, and Society for Risk Analysis, and he was a recipient of the ASA Founders Award and the Mu Sigma Rho William Ward Award for Statistical Education. John, thank you so much for having accepted our invitation to join DaSSWeb. It's really a pleasure and an honor to welcome you, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. It's an honor and a pleasure to join you today. And one of the great aspects of being involved in statistics is the community that you get to meet. And Paul, I don't know when we first met, but I'm sure it was someplace far afield. You know, it was in some country, not our own countries, but it's a pleasure to have these connections that get established and these networking that we all enjoy. So I'm going to start here, and let me just share my screen with you. What I will do is, I'll go through my slides. If you hold questions to the end, that'd be easier because I won't be able to monitor chat or other things. And then we'll bring us back if that works. Does that sound good, Paula? We good? Okay. And I promise this won't be more than 3 or 4 hours. No. So, okay, here we go. Thanks for the invitation. As you can see here, on my slide, I was asked to talk about promoting statistical and data science literacy. And one aspect that I'm going to focus on as part of that is thinking about literacy in terms of the communication dimension of it. I've already been described as kind of what I do. I've been a professor emeritus, but I'm currently still active as a podcaster. And the brand there is the Stats and Stories podcast that you see presented below. You can also see that the book that we had that it came out, and as well as some of these other affiliations. First, thank you to Paula and Eduarda for the invitation. Muito obrigado. All attendees for joining this conversation. I'd also like to recognize my journalism colleagues and collaborators on the Stats and Stories podcast, Rosemary Pennington and Richard Campbell. The American Statistical Association has been a partner for the last, probably more than 8 years of this. And there have been numerous colleagues over the years who have influenced my perspective and practice. First, Miami University, Ohio. What is it? So I thought I'd start with a map just to let you think about this. The the red dot here is where Oxford, Ohio is. Miami, Florida is down on the southern tip of Florida. If to give you some context of what winter is like in these different places, this is what winter looks like at the University of Miami in Florida, and this is what winter looks like where I am now. It doesn't, we don't have snow covering the ground right, well, the streets, but we do have it covering the ground. And it's about 10 degrees Celsius here. So this is not a vacation spot you probably would think to come to in the winter. What I'm going to talk about today, I've broken up into two parts. Part one is talking about, what we believe that statistics and data science is important for understanding our world. And I'm going to try to give you a couple of motivating examples, a context for communication, and thinking about what is quantitative literacy, statistical literacy, and data science literacy, particularly maybe data literacy is the way it's often framed now, and have a little bit of thinking about what does it mean to prepare future data scientists and statisticians for this. And then the second part is to think about what are some of the things we might do as we try to make statistics and data science products and analyses understood. And I'll do that from this very, very personal perspective of thinking about collaboration with journalists and some of the things that we might learn from them and the things we might do with them. So here's a case for communication. And statistics, students, scientists, and many others may experience the following when we present kind of what we do in our discipline. And some of these presentations may discourage an audience from wanting to engage in analysis. And I give credit to Gary Larson for the cartoon and Jim Orris for the customization of it. And so a lot of times when we're talking about what we do, it may be something like this. We say to students, null hypotheses are examined using a test statistic. If this test statistic falls in the critical region, then we fail to reject H naught. And perhaps what they're hearing is blah, blah, blah test, blah, 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 blah critical, blah, blah, blah fail, blah, blah, blah. So I'm not convinced that we're often very successful if this is where we're starting. We have to make sure that we know what the audiences can hear and consume when we're reporting what we do. The second example, the motivation, is an actual conversation paraphrased. The physician says, with your level of cholesterol and other risk factors, you have a 10% risk of heart disease in the next 10 years. Well, the patient might respond, well, what does that mean? To which the physician says, what do you mean? What does that mean? Is this an absolute risk, a relative risk, an odds ratio? A very informed patient might say. And the patient might follow with the question, can it be controlled by exercise or a diet or some statin drug? And the physician immediately says, I think next patient, I'm ready to be done. Well, it's not, the conversation did occur, and part of this was a conversation where the physician did in fact go and get the research that said, here's the way these risk scores are converted into particular the way these profiles, these set of predictor variables, the cholesterol and other risk factors, are converted into a risk score that's converted into a cardiovascular risk. And it was added risk, in fact. And this may lead to understanding these kinds of data, understanding the reports of this leads to a sense of what action needs to occur and how frequently or how quickly it needs to occur. And I just comment that the idea of an absolute change of 10% may be very, very serious and probably is, whereas a relative change from something rare to 10% bigger than that rare number may not. So these are the questions that we need to think about helping people be ready to answer, and we may need to be able to help facilitate that communication. So let's talk a little bit about quantitative literacy, statistical literacy, and data science literacy. Quantitative literacy has been defined in the National Numeracy Network as skills, knowledge, beliefs, dispositions, habits of mind, communication abilities, and problem-solving skills. And their skill, these are all this aggregation that people need to be able to engage effectively in quantitative situations arising in life and work. The summary that I've often liked is the idea that quantitative skills involved kind of at least three domains. One domain I've heard described is you need to be able to understand functional relationships. So for those of you that are thinking about, preparing for retiring 30 or 40 years from now, it's time to have at least some small and continuing investment to take advantage of exponential growth. Having some sense of number and magnitude is critical if you want to think about a national debt that might be in billions or trillions of dollars, or in terms of contaminant loads when you're thinking about parts per billion or parts per trillion or parts per million. What do those mean? What does that comparison mean? Uh, and by the way, the idea of teaching quantitative literacy using the news is not something new. And Bernie Madison, I would is one who talked about that quite early. Now, statistical literacy, Ido Gall, a colleague of ours and the ISI, described that as the ability to interpret, critically evaluate, and communicate about statistical information and messages. So you see that as that's interpretation and critically evaluate the information and arguments and stochastic phenomena, but also to discuss and communicate reactions to this information. So what is our responsibility to help people develop their statistical literacy skills of our audiences, whoever they might be? And they could be students in classrooms or they could be colleagues that we're collaborating with. Now, data literacy or data science literacy, the MIT Sloan reported one includes four abilities: reading data, working with data, analyzing data, and arguing with data. And I love the quote that they had in there: to be data literate, you also have to be verbally literate, numerically literate, and graphically literate. So one of the things that I would like to say is the intersection when I think about these three types of literacies is this idea of communicating and or arguing with data. Now, you'll find this idea of communication being a critical part of education in various groups, and I'll highlight two. One, in the American Statistical Association had a working group on master's degrees in statistics, and I was participated in that. And there was another working group later on undergraduate guidelines. And one common dimension to those two is communication skills. In one recommendation in the master's degree was that the students should be able to have these communication skills, and it must be developed and practiced throughout graduate programs. The undergraduate guidelines said, as part of the recommendations, they need to be able to that students and other, need to be able to communicate complex methods to managers and other audiences, and they need to be able to practice and understand those skills, as well as understanding these ethical standards. Within particular academic degrees, I can comment on the institution that I was spent more than a third of a century at, was the idea that the BS in data science, statistics and data science, an undergraduate major at the university, had not only the idea of analyzing, interpreting data with statistical models and having requisite programming skills, having this foundation that we all we know is valuable, the mathematical basis and theoretical foundations of what we do, but also effectively communicate, both orally and written form, results of stat analyses to both expert and layperson. We need to be able to serve different types of audiences, and to serve and communicate those, we need to do that in different ways. So let me transition into part two of this conversation. And one of my colleagues, Richard Campbell, shared with me a couple of things. One is that this quote that from a book, The Elements of Journalism: the job of the journalist is to make the significant interesting, which I like that. And when there was a visit by a very famous journalist to campus, he said that reporters should not lead their reports with lots of numbers and data, but tell a story that grabs the reader and illustrates the big data to come later in the story. One of the things in statistics and data science that we value and love the work that we do and the analysis we do, but in terms of gauging an audience that's broader than our community, we often have to have this narrative component that goes beyond the statistical component. Now, lastly, my colleague Rosemary Pennington liked to say that she viewed that journalists are supposed to put facts in context. And that's the foundation of work that she did as a reporter and work in her classroom. So facts and context. So I would ask you to think about the parallel here for what a statistician and a data scientist might do. And then we'll use this as part of our general discussion of a strategy or framework to think about critical data research consumption. Well, I think data scientists and statisticians have an obligation to conduct and communicate their results to have impact. You need to be engaging to the reader. You need to make the significant interesting, put facts in context, and all this is important for producing effective and impactful analyses. And I guess I would think, how often do we think about that? And I bet we all do think about it, but I would suggest that we need to have this infused throughout our process, our workflow. When I started thinking about communicating statistics and research, one of the really important work that I found was a book by Cohn and Cope called News and Numbers. Really a classic book for journalists and interested statisticians and people like us. These included questions that journalists should be ready to ask about research and statisticians should be ready to answer. And so what we did is not only we said, well, one tactic for us to start telling these statistics behind the stories and the stories behind the statistics was a podcast. And I'll give you a little bit of background, a little context, the history. Um, my colleague Richard Campbell and I taught a quantitative literacy course together. A journalist and a statistician team taught a class called News and Numbers. And we did this as part of a quantitative literacy faculty learning community. This was back in 2007 and 8. We taught the course in 2009. And we realized you can engage in interesting analyses in a classroom of people that don't necessarily have, kind of tremendous amounts of quantitative and statistical mathematical foundations. This was mainly a quantitative literacy class that was designed for students that would be in the humanities and journalism. We realized that probably wasn't sustainable for the two of us to be doing this without any kind of to be able to do this routinely, because there were only 25 students perhaps in that class, and really we needed to find we loved doing this. We needed to find a way to do this at a broader scale, and that led to us thinking about doing the podcast. The podcasts were coming online. We said, well, what would that look like? And we ended up doing our first episode in 2013. We only did 3 episodes in 2013 because everyone had to be in person. Everyone had to be present on campus. It was a lot harder to do. I mean, I would think that Paulo and Eduarda would also recognize that trying to do biweekly seminars with people coming from around the country would be quite a challenge to do if you were having to have people in person for each of these. In 2016, we ended up adding our new moderator. That's where my colleague Rosemary Pennington joined us. We ended up starting to go virtual in 2017. Our first guest who for that 26th episode was David Spiegelhalter. We then ended up going to also talking a different format. While the regular show was about 28 minutes, the short story form was about 7 to 12 minutes. And we broke through with getting some ASA funding. And that led to having our 100th episode in 2019, 200th in 21, 2 years later in 2023, our 300th episode. And the motivation of this was led to writing a book and then generating an audiobook in 2022 and 24 respectively. Now, one way that we thought about this is part of being literacy is thinking about how do we consume things with this critical eye, and what is it that we need, that sort of statistical skills to think about consuming information. And we ended up with a working list that framed all of our consideration. One is what is claimed, and is it appropriate? Who might be claiming it? Why is it being claimed? Is there a good measure of impact provided? How was the claim supported? What evidence was reported? What's the quality and strength of evidence? And now, see, this is where we come into play very clearly. Is it reasonable in itself? And what is your prior belief about the system? Do you have confirmation bias? Are you looking for evidence that only supports what you believe? How much does this claim fit with what we know? And how much does it matter to you? Thinking about the impact on a population versus your behavior changed as a consequence of what you've learned. Let me give you an example. One question that was a headline: what happens to your brain when you binge watch a TV series? And this came out, gosh, now about 8 years ago, and we were thinking about, okay, let's deconstruct this story, and that was part of the 5th chapter of the book that I mentioned. The data cited in this story included a Netflix Media Center report, a government report, the American Time Use Survey that was summarized, and a presentation at a scientific meeting. So this was an exploration of how binge watching, I mean, certainly something that many of us have done, may impact us both cognitively and emotionally. There's idea that there's stress alleviation, although a caution of letdown, and they're pointers for responsible binge watching. So that's what was given to us in the story. Now as you start to open this up, you realize that there are multiple data sources that were used as the foundation of the sources. And then you need to think about data sources providing different amounts of information and types of information and also quality of information. And there are quotes from experts, but that's not the same thing as systematic study or review of evidence. So how do you help prepare people to think about this? And then there's also some things that are true in that how the news covers information. And that is if things are current, currency and novelty, something that's current and something that's new drives eyes, drives attention and to news coverage of research. So when you think about what's claimed and who's claiming it, what's claimed is that brain chemistry, psychological responses, stress reduction can be associated with binge watching, and the caution not to binge to the exclusion of human interaction, and then some recommendations. And it's claimed by an NBC news writer who integrates these data sources for this assertion. Why is it claimed? Because TV viewing habits have changed. You know, having streaming services versus even cable services is something that's different now than it was decades ago. That you can view on different platforms. Your consumption may change. That was something that was learned from the American Time Use Survey. The binge watching behavior was something that was monitored, if you will, in the Netflix survey. And there are drivers of binge watching. And this is where kind of the individual narrative, the conversations with people, experts came up, as well as a conference presentation. And these studies of brain chemistry and responses to it. And then finally, there was this caution, again, probably tied to the interviews with these specialists. So as we think about research and about this, we think there's a hierarchy of information and stories. There's probability samples that we know about all the way to kind of these convenience samples to personal opinion. We have to think about how things are coded. We have to think about sampling variability, how it drives margin of error. We have to ask, why was a study conducted? This was produced by Netflix Media. It summarized viewing habits. Almost half the report was devoted to listing the series that might be binged. You know, so that's why thinking about who is the source of it, and that experts can provide great quotes, but really, are they really experts in the area being considered? And do they have evidence in support of assertions? And, you know, standardization becomes quite important when you think about confidence of respondents and how they answer the same questions. Now, let me change gears just a little bit. How do you think about things, or what are some example activities that you might consider that will help you explore statistical concepts? Well, we had a conversation where Carrie Mengerson, who's a current ISI vice president, who's also a leading scholar in Australia, came on our show, and we ended up, after talking to her, said, well, we're going to generate a contest to try to explain Bayes better. And so it was the Better Bayes contest. And we asked people to submit a headline and a lead sentence explaining what Bayesian analysis is, and, you know, how you might explain it to someone who's not a specialist, not looking for a deep explanation, but nuts and bolts of what a Bayesian analysis is. And, you know, we then had the winner on and talk about this work. And we had some that was like Using Bayes to Binge, a Netflix original series by Lucy D'Agostino McGowan. And her lead sentence was, deciding which Netflix series to binge based on prior shows you've enjoyed, pick one. One episode in, decide if you like it. Not sure? Watch another episode. You're a Bayesian. And you know, this is really an interesting strategy to think about. If you can take what you've done and summarize it into a headline that would engage someone in a sentence that would capture it, you know, and by the way, you see that, you know, Lucy ended up getting a couple of lines in more than one sentence, but ultimately did in fact kind of capture your interest and say, well, why is that? How does that work? And Rasmus Bath had another one on uncertainty modeling, which was a little more technical. But these are all, again, ideas of kind of doing this iteratively. Our winner ultimately submitted a haiku. You know, Better Bayes, Bayesian methods, making stuff you partly know, link that with what you don't. Frequentist methods fear the null hypothesis and large p-values. It pays to go Bayes, epistemologically obvious in prior. So, you know, it also has fun. I mean, you can do these kinds of things. Now, we've done this sort of for some of these major episode numbers, sort of these ones of, oh, we've hit a 150, we've hit a 200, a 300. We also did one contest for our 200th episode called the Mean Median Mode Contest. So we said, find a meme you could have one you created and take this image and have, that somehow captures some statistical idea. And Ninka Kroll and Eric Daza were the winners of this. And Ninka's one was, statisticians be like, why can't you just be normal? And the data screams, which is, I love this. And Eric took the different path of kind of saying, well, when you're on the highway of correlation and all of a sudden your intuition causes you to want to veer off on the path to causation. Again, these were just, people trying to find very concise ways of communicating concepts that are important. We did another episode where we challenged people to say, my headline's better than what's being reported. Could you write something that was kind of more engaging? And this particular contest, the winner, Dan Gachis, came upon this story that said Seattle air quality among the worst in the world. Well, as he dug into this, he realized that this was a consequence of the fact that there had been horrible wildfires. I mean, right now in California, in the U.S., it's been nightmarish. But this was his headline that he suggested was "Wildfires Diminish Seattle's Air Quality." I mean, it was capturing kind of the cause of the response that was being observed, as opposed to more of this inflammatory note that was in the original title. We also did things such as a data visualization contest. And, as the episodes there's going to be more information that will be shared with you after this webinar. My slides will be available to you, and you'll be able to do, you can follow some of these links to see both the data set. The data set still is available, so you can download it and play with it yourself. But then there's also, you can see some of the visualizations that we found were a winner. And the winner, Nicole Mark, did a lovely dashboard of kind of the displays. So I'm going to wrap up and allow us to have some time for conversation. The conclusion that I'd like to summarize is that to develop statistical and data science products that are used in impact decisions are something we all share. It's a common goal. We need to communicate these in a way that would be understood by a target audience, and I believe that's critical. And we can educate ourselves and others to produce as well as to consume these results. I've really enjoyed, and I believe that deconstructing news and research and the sort of public scholarship, and how do we tell our story more broadly, and doing this through a mechanism of a podcast is one way that we've done this. I would say thank you. there's some contact information here. There's even bonus material for those that are interested, including some questions from News and Numbers from Conan Cope. Tim Harford had some lovely work, and The Data Detective. Also, his More or Less podcast is brilliant. And David Spiegelhalter, The Art of Statistics. And you'll see some questions that you can use there that have been claimed. And then I would just suggest that you look at that. And then also some idea of presenting research in context. And this last piece is an example of, if you're telling stories about aquatic toxicology of some organism and some chemicals and a craft, you can also show kind of what's been impacted, what's impacting it, and what are the organisms that might be there at the context. I think that I will stop the share right now and say, hey, you made it. You survived. So thanks for your attention. I'm happy to chat about this. I hope this is okay, Paula and Eduarda. I thought it was important to have kind of some time to chat about this, and up to you.